Welcome to Hallelujah, We're Bad, where historian Mary White will tell us about the bad old days of fun and excitement in Ithaca's West End, from the days of the Erie Canal to the present. We'll recall the antics of successive waves of rowdy teamsters, gamblers, cockfighters, bootleggers, musicians, and students, as well as the reformers who tried to keep at least a small lid on things or salvage the damage.
Good evening. I want to present some of the stories surrounding, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Surrounding the pretty much endless tension between those who believe in controlled behavior leading ultimately to a heavenly afterlife, and those who say, the hell with it, let's have fun. Both points of view have been a part of Ithaca culture. Bad and good and in-between people have lived here side by side and simultaneously tormented and tolerated each other for a long time. The valley at the head of Cayuga Lake, the place we call Ithaca, was home to several small family groups of Iroquois. The manners and morals of the Iroquois are not the subject of this presentation. However, it is reported that French Jesuits made sincere efforts to lead them to salvation in the 17th century, and that most of the Iroquois were minimally grateful. And thus the tone was set. Ithaca as a home to unenlightened sinners and to most earnest and well-meaning reformers. From Jesuit fathers Menard and Carheil in 1660 to Daniel Berrigan and the Dalai Lama. The Iroquois made the logical but fatal error of supporting the British when the colonists revolted and paid the price. So we will consider the lives of the European and African-descended settlers who moved on to the Iroquois farmlands, the first of them arriving with babies and livestock, tools and seeds in 1789, intent on subsistence farming. These folks probably worked too hard to be very bad, but part of their corn crop may have been turned into something other than flour and pig feed. Applejack was also an option. Sadly, these first few families were unsophisticated about matters of deeds and taxes and speedily found themselves dislodged by Simeon DeWitt, a surveyor who had served on General Washington's staff. Water power being the means of factory production in this early industrial era, DeWitt recognized the economic potential of a valley with 5 creeks. He and his cousin, Abraham Bloodgood, acquired legal title to most of the lands we know as the city of Ithaca. He sent a nephew to lay out streets and lots and began selling the parcels. People came, mills sawed lumber and ground flour, houses were built on the town site, and farmers planted crops nearby. Soon the community was home to a rough crowd of drinkers and brawlers, a few sober citizens who hoped for a heavenly future, and some who just wanted to make a profit dealing with the others. By 1806, there were 2 streets, Aurora and Owego, with 17 families living in 12 buildings, 3 of those identified as taverns. There was also a lending library with $300 worth of books, a considerable investment. 1812 brought another war with England with an enormous commercial impact on Ithaca. As many as 800 teams traveled the road from Ithaca to Owego, hauling loads of gypsum and salt each day. Figuring 4 horses and at least 1 van to a wagon, that would mean that there were at least 100 drivers seeking food, shelter, and entertainment in the village each night, with an additional workforce to meet the needs and desires of these men and their horses. Farriers, grooms, harness makers, vendors of hay, makers of boots and shirts, car dealers, musicians, and dancing girls. In addition to the wagoners were probably even larger numbers of boatmen. Gambling, horse racing, and what was called licentiousness were very attractive to this crowd in their few hours of leisure between trips. Businesses catering to the wagoners and boatmen were mostly located in the West End, near the landings and boatyards. In 1805, Simeon DeWitt had sent another of his relatives, a young cousin, and no doubt in need of a job, to gather the village's 7 Presbyterians into a church. The Reverend Garrett Mandeville was about as successful among the villagers as the Jesuits were among the Iroquois. He was no match for the exuberant orneriness of a village that was beginning to be called Sodom. An informally organized vigilante group calling themselves the Moral Society more or less ruled the village. Anyone who offended their sense of what was right and fit was subjected to beatings, dousing with cold water, and more. Offenses might be loud drunkenness, being a meddler in the affairs of others, being dishonest or mean, being a coward or a bully or a boaster. So-called vagrants were not permitted to set up puppet shows, astonish the people by feats of legerdemain, or run gambling games. The Moral Society had its own newspaper, The Castigator, which ran threats towards those they disapproved of. One of the editor's concerns was with families who allowed girl children to wear immodest dresses. However, the Moral Society was apparently willing to employ those who were less than moral to forward their purposes of intimidation. An early memoir of village life wrote that one punishment for drunkenness by the Moral Society was said to be conveying him to the care of 8 or 10 Lazaronas, who hesitated not to strip the unfortunate man of his clothing and exhibit him to the crowd. I'm not sure just who or what Lazaronas were, but we may infer that they were a group of fearfully evil-minded women. In a village of fewer than 100 houses, where were 8 or 10 women willing to expose a drunk to be found? Certainly not in the church-going part of town. But in the West End sub-community, it would seem anything was possible. There was also a competing group who called themselves the Chaotic Society. On one occasion, several leaders of the Moral Society were bound, gagged, and left overnight in a pig pen, presumably by their rivals. The hapless Garrett Mandeville resigned in 1816, harassed and threatened, utterly unable to influence the rowdy element, including the doctors who raced their horses at the hour of Sunday services. The schoolhouse in which church services were held was torn down by a mob. This event was either the last straw for Reverend Mandeville or a first attempt at intimidating his successor. But Mandeville was followed by Reverend William Wisner, an entirely different sort of man. Uncompromising is a mild description of Reverend Wisner. He seemingly believed so firmly in his own salvation and deliverance into heaven that he was utterly fearless. He came bringing his reluctant wife and family and began the business of reforming not just individuals, but the entire character of the village. With his front door nailed shut and a tavern sign hung over it, he went out by the window and mounted his horse, which had been shaved and whitewashed. He preached in a drafty barn for lack of a church, eventually installed seats and a stove, and soon raised money to build a frame church on the site of the present one. He believed in sobriety, that all church members should avoid consuming alcohol or offering alcohol for consumption to customers or employees. Would-be church members complained that they could not hire workers for harvest, as no one would accept employment where cider or ale was not provided with meals. However unlikely it may seem to the cynical eyes of the 21st century, Wisner is credited with changing the moral tone and attitude of most of the village. Whether it was the force of his character or the terrifying persuasiveness of his thundering sermons, people flocked to his church, and the raucous voices of the Sunday horse racing crowd were heard no more. That's not to say that horse racing went away altogether, and a distillery was built on Fall Creek in 1817. The village continued to grow, developed legal forms of government, and became a county seat. The Erie Canal connected to the end of the lake and offered expanded commercial opportunities. Steamboats came next. The enterprise was launched on Cayuga Lake in 1821, stuck in a sandbar, freed with effort, and proceeded up the lake with a volunteer replacing the engineer, who was incapacitated with drink. By the middle of the 19th century, the little settlement was a center of transport and commerce, with boats and trains and mills and factories, as well as a variety of churches.